Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving into a collection of sources, articles, research papers, personal notes that give us a really granular look at the Republican Party after the 2022 midterms.
Right.
What these sources reveal is, well, it's a party wrestling with its identity. You see internal struggle, shifts in power, and these competing ideas about where it should go next.
Yeah, and a lot of that tension, as you can see in the material, really plays out through the lens of the MAGA movement's influence and, the varied reactions to it.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive, to pull out the most important insights from all this stuff, understand the different forces pushing and pulling the party, and try to figure out what this complex picture actually means for the future.
It's a fascinating snapshot, really, because these documents don't just report on election results. They get into the mechanics of party control, the deeply personal dynamics involved in what was clearly a period of significant change.
Absolutely. And the sources kick us off with something pretty strategic. How the term MAGA itself actually became a deliberate political tool for Democrats heading into 2022.
That's right. There's this internal Democratic research from early that year, led by Navin Nayak and Jeff Garin. It dives right into this.
They were looking at whether MAGA could really land as an effective attack line.
Yeah, and Nayak apparently was initially pretty skeptical. He thought voters might not even know what the acronym stood for,
Huh. And the findings, according to these sources, they turned out to be quite surprising.
Very. For one, over 80% of voters were familiar with MAGA. That's much higher recall than they anticipated.
Wow. Okay.
But the real kicker was the unfavorability. A full 50% had a negative opinion of the term.
Half of voters.
Exactly. And what the research seemed to highlight was that MAGA carried these negative connotations, but maybe without some of the, let's say, limited positive baggage that the name Trump himself still held for certain voters, especially in the Republican base.
Okay. So it acted as a kind of shorthand.
Precisely. A shorthand that captured everything Democrats wanted to critique about the modern Republican Party. Things like being power-hungry, divisive, extreme, maybe even dangerous, evoking associations with racism or attacks on democracy.
But without having to spell out those specific words, which could cause backlash.
Right. You didn't have to use those direct, potentially more inflammatory terms yourself. It kind of packaged it all up.
Like a lightning rod, drawing in negative feelings, but maybe insulating the attacker a bit.
That's a good way to put it. And the rollout, it seems, was quite deliberate. Mike Donnellan at the White House reportedly saw it fitting President Biden's broader theme, that battle for the soul of the nation idea.
And Biden started using it, didn't he? Sort of softly at first.
Yeah, the sources mention a DNC fundraiser in April 2022. He said something like, "This is the MAGA party, not a joke."
And then he cranked it up a bit later.
He did. The next month, May, he used the phrase ultra MAGA agenda in a speech about the economy, calling it extreme.
Right, I remember that. And the reaction, well, the sources note that pundits openly rocked ultra MAGA.
Oh, yeah. Comparisons to Hillary Clinton's deplorables comment from 2016 were everywhere.
But here's where it gets really interesting and kind of echoes that deplorable situation. A lot of Trump supporters, they just leaned into the label, didn't they?
Totally. They started making and wearing ultra MAGA hats, flags. Trump himself, according to the sources, started selling super MAGA shirts.
And you had figures like Elise Stefanik publicly saying,
"I am ultra MAGA, and I'm proud of it."
Yeah.
Embracing it completely.
Yet, despite the mockery from some and the embrace from the base, the sources suggest that from the Democratic strategist's perspective, the whole thing was seen as a success.
It seems so. Navin Nayak noted it resonated online. Democrats started talking about MAGA Republicans way more often than Republicans, seemed to be using labels like radical socialist Democrats.
So the idea was the term was already out there. They just needed to amplify it.
Exactly. They didn't invent it. It was already part of the vocabulary. They just turned up the volume.
And the strategic thinking here, according to Nayak and the sources, was that by focusing the negative attention on MAGA extremism or MAGA Republicans, specifically labeling it as a wing of the party, it potentially created what they called a permission structure.
A permission structure? What does that mean exactly?
Well, the idea was to make it easier for Republicans who might feel, uncomfortable with that wing of the party to distance themselves, or maybe even voice dissent without feeling like they were attacking their entire party.
Ah, I see. Trying to carve out space for those internal divisions to become more visible.
Right. And the polling, it seems, indicated this might be working. Their research found nearly half of all voters, 48%, said they'd be less likely to vote for someone who identified as a MAGA Republican.
And that included significant chunks of key groups.
Yeah, 58% of independents and even, remarkably, 17% of Republicans themselves.
So the goal was kind of twofold. Get the base, the choir, to hear it and repeat it, while the middle moderates, independents, would hear it and start to feel uneasy.
And what's also fascinating is how adaptable that MAGA label proved to be across different issues throughout 2022.
That's a great point. After the Uvalde school shooting, sources show it was quickly used to attack Republicans for blocking gun regulation.
And then when Roe v. Wade was overturned.
Same thing. It became a way to brand Republicans as extremists on abortion rights, which is, a position largely unpopular with the broader public.
And all summer long, you had the January 6th committee hearings providing this constant backdrop.
Right. Linking the MAGA label directly to the attempt to overturn the 2020 election, reminding people what the movement was seen as being capable of.
The sources describe this as laddering up. All these different issues laddering up to one consistent narrative.
Yeah, portraying an extreme wing of the party as hurrying average Americans, threatening basic rights and freedoms. Even the House Democrats, super picky, apparently leaned into it heavily in their ads, framing opponents as extreme using that specific language.
So it became this proxy for Trump, basically. But one that resonated with the base, didn't cause as much immediate backlash, and kept moderates potentially open to voting Democratic.
That seems to be the strategic thinking outlined in the sources, yes.
Okay, so that's one side of the picture, this external strategic use of the MAGA label. But our sources also paint a really vivid picture of the pushback happening inside the Republican Party. There was a significant resistance movement building from within.
Absolutely. And a key figure in, both documenting and maybe facilitating some of this resistance, as detailed in the sources, is Sarah Longwell. She's an anti-Trump Republican strategist.
Right. And she launched this major campaign, didn't she? Like $10 million.
Yeah, a $10 million nationwide campaign using testimonials. Yeah. But not from politicians, from real Republican voters. People who felt increasingly alienated by the party's direction under Trump.
And her core idea here is really insightful, especially, today, with trust in institutions being so low. She believed the most credible messengers weren't pundits or officials, but people like me.
Relatable, everyday Republicans just sharing their honest struggle.
Exactly. What they said mattered, sure, but maybe even more important was whether the listener felt the messenger was trustworthy, was authentic. The messenger is the message, essentially.
And her background, as the sources kind of lay out, really shaped this view. Growing up Republican, working for people like Rick Santorum, chairing the log cabin Republicans.
Experiencing Trump's 2016 rise very personally, connecting with other never-Trumpers like Bill Kristol, Steve Schmidt, forming groups like Defending Democracy together.
Right. She built this network of these disaffected voters and encouraged them to share their stories publicly, seeing it as this really essential, though often quite difficult thing to do.
And the testimonials themselves, they really capture that difficulty, that personal struggle. You hear these stories like Kathy in Pennsylvania agonizing over Doug Mastriano's abortion stance.
Or Wendy calling him a crackpot or dangerous. Tom in Arizona grappling with Kari Lake and the big lie.
The sources describe this palpable anguish these people expressed, this internal conflict of being lifelong Republicans who felt they just had to vote against their party or at least certain nominees.
And this willingness for Republicans to publicly break ranks wasn't just limited to Longwell's project. The sources give us numerous other examples, especially in those key 2022 races.
The Josh Shapiro campaign for governor in Pennsylvania is a prime case study here.
Definitely. Shapiro's opponent, Doug Mastriano, his history became absolutely central to the race. You had the election denial, his presence at January 6th, the ties to Steve Bannon.
The hardline abortion stance. That photo in a Confederate uniform, even his academic writings that surfaced. Shapiro's campaign really hammered these points.
And Shapiro's strategy, framing the race around reclaiming freedom, contrasting his vision with Mastriano's positions on, bodily autonomy, unions, public education, voting rights.
The idea that Mastriano might only certify results he agreed with.
Right. That whole framing resonated beyond just the typical Democratic voters.
It certainly seemed to. Shapiro got endorsements from a pretty notable list of Pennsylvania Republicans. Former Congressman Charlie Dent, former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff.
Several former state lawmakers, a former Trump White House lawyer, Jim Schultz, and even a sitting county commission chairman, Morgan Boyd.
And Boyd's comment, cited in the sources, is really revealing. He said he was only saying what? A lot of Republican officials across the state are thinking privately.
Wow. Suggesting this discomfort was much wider, but maybe often unspoken within the party ranks.
Yeah. And another figure mentioned is James Greenwood, who ran a PAC targeting moderate Republicans. He basically acknowledged, we don't live in normal times, and focused on direct contact to peel off even a small slice of crossover votes, recognizing that could swing close races.
And you see similar dynamics in other states mentioned in the sources, like 150 Republicans for Whitmer in Michigan.
50 Republicans backing the Democratic AG candidate in deep red Idaho.
Pete Ernott, a longtime GOP consultant in Nevada, endorsing the Democratic Senator Catherine Cortez Masto. He even compared her favorably to a Republican, interestingly.
And the story of Randy Stamps in Tennessee is quite telling. A longtime Republican official, he endorsed a Democrat for a state office.
And what's striking there is his reason wasn't really policy. He said he was deeply troubled by the Republican candidate's temperament, their apparent unwillingness to listen to different views. He saw it as a growing phenomenon in the Republican Party that I would like to discourage.
He still saw himself as a Republican, but one who should have the freedom to vote against a nominee if needed.
Which is a powerful stance.
Yeah.
Then you have David Nierenberg in Washington State, another great example. Longtime GOP donor, Romney supporter, ends up endorsing the Democrat running against the Republican incumbent who'd lost her primary.
Because her opponent was an election denier who'd targeted her for voting to impeach Trump.
Exactly. And Nierenberg's decision, the sources detail, was deeply personal, linked to his family history, descendants of Holocaust survivors, WWII veterans. He saw election denial and the downplaying of January 6th as, his words, an attempt at a Reichstag fire.
Strong words.
Very. He said he wore being called a Rhino Romney blowhard as a badge of honor, felt a moral obligation to oppose what he saw as nastiness and incivility.
And down in Mesa, Arizona, you have the Republican mayor, John Giles, publicly crossing the aisle to endorse Democrats in statewide races.
Yeah, he stated it very plainly. He saw election denial as an existential threat to democracy, and he strongly believed that saying nothing is acquiescing.
You talked about the backlash, too, right? Like online versus in person.
He did. Described overwhelming online negativity, 10-1, calling him a traitor. But then in person, it was 10-1 support, people thanking him, saying he was giving them a voice. Interesting contrast. He felt disappointed more Republicans weren't speaking out, believed that mainstream people have got to reclaim the Republican Party if it's going to have a future at all. He saw leadership in that moment as requiring courage.
Which, of course, brings us pretty directly to Liz Cheney, perhaps the most visible figure of this internal Republican resistance.
Absolutely. Her role as vice chair of the January 6th committee was just crucial. She relentlessly focused on documenting Trump's culpability, yes, but strategically, she centered testimony from Republicans.
Trump's own aides, his attorney general, White House counsel, state officials.
Even Mike Pence's lawyer. Respected conservative figures like Judge Michael Luttig. Using Republican messengers like that really bolstered the committee's credibility with certain audiences and starkly highlighted the opposition within the party itself.
Her point being that institutions only held on January 6th because specific individuals showed courage.
Precisely. And the sources include this poignant scene from a lunch she had with some of these disaffected Republicans. She basically encouraged them not to give up, to remain courageous, stay in the fight. Kathy Petsis, who was there, recalled Cheney's response when someone made a light comment. Cheney just quietly said, "You don't have to worry about my courage."
Wow. A quiet but powerful assertion.
Exactly. And Cheney kept speaking out publicly after the committee wrapped up, emphasizing the danger hadn't passed. She specifically pointed to Arizona, with candidates suggesting they wouldn't accept results they didn't like, calling it the front lines of this ongoing threat.
Which raises the really big question for these alienated Republicans. What should they actually do?
And Cheney's answer, as documented, was pretty clear. She said she was not ready to say we're going to allow Trump and those who are at war with democracy to hijack our party.
So stay and fight?
Stay and fight from within, focusing particularly on the local level. She urged them to battle for those precinct committee seats because, in her view, these anti-democratic forces are actively trying to take control of the party from the bottom up, to fundamentally change its character into something anti-American, as she put it.
She really drove that point home with a personal statement, too, didn't she? About her own voting record.
Yeah, very powerful. She said she voted Republican for almost 40 years, didn't think she'd ever voted Democrat before. But then she said if she lived in Arizona now, she absolutely would vote Democrat.
Because the stakes were that high?
Because she felt the country was at the edge of an abyss. The priority had to be voting for serious people and holding officials accountable regardless of party.
So, okay, you have this resistance from within, sometimes public, sometimes quiet. Republicans uncomfortable, willing to cross lines. But as the sources show, the MAGA movement wasn't just sitting back. They had a counter strategy to solidify their control over the party machinery.
Oh, yes. Very actively pursuing it, most notably through something called the precinct strategy.
Right. Promoted heavily by figures like Dan Schultz, often on platforms like Steve Bannon's War Room podcast.
And his core idea is simple. Taking control of the Republican Party happens from the bottom up, through these grassroots precinct seats. He frames it as the mechanism for a takeover, acknowledges it's not guaranteed to save the Republic, but it gives them, in his words, a shot.
And our sources detail some of Schultz's specific, sometimes pretty intense viewpoints fueling this strategy.
They do. Concerns about communism, a strong desire to get rid of voting machines entirely.
He even advocated for death penalty trials for people involved with COVID vaccines, believing they're bioweapons.
Yeah, that's in there. Also vehemently opposed to what he calls porn out of schools, which he explicitly includes transgender nonsense, drag queen crapola, deep anger at the FBI, CIA over Trump, Hunter Biden's laptop, seeing a two-tiered system of justice.
And quoting the outlaw Josie Wales.
About getting plumb mad dog mean when things look bad. It reflects a certain confrontational approach. This is the kind of ideology driving some of these grassroots efforts.
And Steve Bannon has been a huge amplifier of this strategy, seeing it as the way to finish the job, transform the Republican Party.
Right. And interestingly, the sources note Bannon wasn't actually surprised by the 2022 midterm losses. He didn't blame the MAGA candidates for being unelectable.
He blamed the establishment.
Exactly. Blamed the establishment's failure for nominating candidates who couldn't win over moderates, in his view.
So his perspective is that the two factions, the establishment, country club elites, and the working class nationalist MAGA base are just fundamentally incompatible.
That's his argument. He says there's not a big tent large enough to hold both. He's explicitly not interested in winning back establishment Republicans. His vision is about expanding the MAGA base, even trying to recruit disillusioned people from the far left.
Pointing to 2016 and the 74 million Trump votes in 2020 as proof his populist nationalist approach works, despite what critics say.
Right, and this whole battle for control really played out publicly in that RNC chairman race in early 2023.
Yeah, that was framed as a major contest. The incumbent, Ronna McDaniel, versus challengers like Harmeet Tillen and Mike Lindell, who were vying for that overthrow the establishment mantle.
And the sources paint this really vivid contrast. The official RNC meeting was at the fancy Waldorf Astoria.
While nearby, at a residence inn, figures like John Fredericks organized this unofficial debate for the challengers.
Fredericks reportedly saw the Waldorf meeting as the elite just locking out the grassroots, highlighting the symbolic difference, the difference in atmosphere and access.
And at that unofficial debate, the attacks on McDaniel were direct.
Oh, yeah. Caroline Wren, Dillon's campaign manager, slammed McDaniel for underperformance, if not outright failures, over 3 election cycles. And notably, blamed not real elections, not bad candidates.
Shifting the blame.
Right. Wren also acknowledged they had to play the game that they play with mail-in and early voting for now, but stressed the ultimate focus had to be election integrity, which is, central to the MAGA base's concerns.
The internal dynamics described here are fascinating, though. It seems those public attacks by Dillon and Wren, calling RNC members elite cronies, played well on right-wing media.
But maybe not so well with the actual RNC members whose votes they needed?
That's what the sources suggest. Meanwhile, McDaniel focused on the inside game, working her relationships with those 168 voting members.
And in the end, McDaniel won the chair race pretty decisively.
She did. But figures like John Fredericks offered a prediction that really echoes that precinct strategy idea. He suggested something like half these 168 you're seeing are gone in 2 years.
Arguing the real takeover has to happen from the bottom up.
And the sources provide these incredibly specific, sometimes frankly unsettling examples of this bottom-up conflict playing out locally. That Maricopa County Board of Supervisors meeting to certify the 2022 election.
Wow. Yeah, that's a prime illustration. You have the Republican chairman, Bill Gates, Republican recorder Stephen Richer, sitting there for hours listening to just waves of angry public comments.
Fueled by conspiracy theories about election fraud. even though independent reviews confirmed the results, and other Republicans had already debunked specific claims, like those from 2000 Mules.
And Stephen Richer's personal experience, detailed in the sources. It's really telling about the cost of just stating the truth in that environment.
He tried to reassure Republican groups about the election's integrity, knowing it would make him unpopular.
Knowing it would cost him support. He describes facing threats, developing PTSD, ultimately deciding not to run again.
And the comments themselves at that hearing give you a real window into the intensity.
Oh, absolutely. Figures like Joe Altman calling himself the chief election denier, Kathy Roscoe calling the supervisors 7 traitors, referencing violent revolution, Ben Bergquam linking election issues to cartels and corruption, Chris Hamlet framing it as a spiritual battle needing body armor.
The sources even note small details, like people fluttering her hands instead of applauding, or a woman giving inconsistent stories about where she was from and what she saw with the Minion machines.
It really brings to life the level of distrust and, frankly, anger permeating some of these local party spaces.
And the conflict wasn't just about challenging elected officials. It spilled over into controlling the internal party structure itself, like that Maricopa County GOP meeting to choose state committeemen.
Right. That meeting showcased a fight over the rules, specifically banning proxy votes.
Which people like Kathy Petsis, a longtime precinct committeeman, saw as a deliberate move to disenfranchise certain voters and limit who could gain influence.
And Petsis herself lost her bid for state committeemen in that process. The sources even note another figure, Marissa Hamilton, apparently texting a reporter to kind of gloat about Petsis losing.
Oof. And the tension peaked at a later county meeting where they proposed censuring the Republican supervisors and Recorder Richer for certifying the election.
And Kathy Petsis made this really remarkable decision. Despite knowing the hostile environment, she chose to speak against the resolution.
What was that like for her?
The sources describe it vividly. Immediate, overwhelming boos and jeers, people calling her proxy queen.
But she spoke anyway.
She did. Amidst the heckling, she predicted their actions would lead to Katie Hobbs winning the governorship, saying it had already happened. She tried to defend the censured Republicans as upstanding individuals, but the noise was just deafening.
But she didn't back down.
No. What stands out is her refusal to show defeat. She just kept smiling, thinking, as the notes say, "Don't let them see them getting to you." They did not need to worry about her courage.
While others who opposed the censure apparently stayed silent. It highlights the pressure.
Immense pressure. And the sources give us a parallel case study up in Michigan, showing how these America First Precinct delegates, actively recruited by people like Deborah L., calling them an America First Army, systematically took control of key party processes there.
Right, because in Michigan, unlike some states, the precinct delegates actually nominate the candidates for Attorney General and Secretary of State.
Exactly. And these new delegates reportedly used questionnaires, pointed questions about, defining a rhino, the 2020 election results, to Minion voting machines January 6th.
And this process led directly to nominating election deniers Matt DePerno and Christina Caramo,
who then went on to lose badly in the 2022 general election.
But even with those losses, the fight for internal control just kept going. The sources detailed this chaotic Saginaw County GOP meeting led by a 20-year-old named Josiah Jaster.
Yeah, he apparently used parliamentary procedure to challenge the existing leadership. Led to chaos, shouting, even a threat to call the police.
But his faction ultimately won that battle, took control of that meeting, and elected their delegates to the state convention.
That's what the sources say, which then set the stage for the state convention battle for party chair.
And interestingly, Trump's endorsement for DePerno for state chair seemed less influential than maybe expected.
Yeah, partly because, according to the sources, some felt his earlier endorsements in the state had been heavily influenced by the outgoing co-chair, Michonne Maddock. There was some skepticism.
And the convention itself sounds like pure chaos. Deep distrust, especially around the voting process.
Delegates reportedly didn't trust the machines. Talk of issues with flash drives and laptops. The sources quote one old-school Republican, Marla Rielly Braun, who abstained from the vote entirely.
Why?
She said the choices presented were just not acceptable. Expressed extreme frustration, calling them these fucking hillbillies who needed to be dealt with. Very raw.
And ultimately, Christina Caramo won the state chair race.
Yeah.
The candidate who never conceded her 2022 loss in campaigns on Christian nationalism and spiritual warfare themes.
She did. But what's really key here, and the sources emphasize this, is that even for people like Josiah Jaster, who led that county-level revolt, the primary motivation wasn't necessarily some deep ideological split on Trump's policies or even election integrity concerns. They often agreed on those things.
So the clash was more about process, control, who held power within the party structure.
Exactly. It was often centered on process control and who got to run things.
And that quote from Michonne Maddock, the outgoing co-chair, about handing the gavel to someone more extreme than her, not really, no one is, that kind of underscores the trajectory the party organization has taken in some places, according to these sources.
It really does. These examples, Arizona, Michigan, they drive home how the MAGA movement has been actively working and in some cases succeeding at gaining control of the party machinery from the ground up, even in places where candidates linked to the movement struggled electorally.
So as we kind of reflect on the outcomes here, it's clear from the sources that while many MAGA-aligned candidates lost key races in 2022.
Right. The general election results weren't great for them in many swing states.
The movement simultaneously achieved pretty significant gains in controlling the actual party machinery, local level, state level, in certain areas.
Kathy Petzis's reflection after the Arizona election, it captures that paradox perfectly, I think. She felt vindicated, right? The candidates she opposed lost, proving her point about electability. But she also had this sobering realization that the ideologically rigid, sometimes conspiracy-minded fringe still controlled the party structure locally.
Which makes changing course incredibly difficult.
Yeah, because as she observed, people at a certain point, their minds cannot be changed. To change their minds means they were wrong. And that is the hardest thing for some people. It gets tied up in identity.
And Bannon's perspective just reinforces that idea of fundamental incompatibility. He doesn't see a path for unity between the establishment and MAGA factions.
It seems the sources paint this picture of a party really grappling with two distinct, maybe irreconcilable priorities. Right. One faction focused on winning general elections, which means appealing to a broader electorate.
And another focused on ideological transformation, seizing control of the party apparatus from the bottom up, prioritizing loyalty, adherence to specific narratives, especially around election integrity. Sometimes it seems over-electability.
Exactly. That tension is palpable throughout these accounts.
So, wrapping up this deep dive into the sources, what does this all really mean? Well, it reveals a Republican Party in the middle of a profound and often pretty chaotic internal civil war.
Yeah, maybe civil war isn't too strong a term based on some of these accounts.
It's a battle fought not just at the ballot box in November, but in these less visible arenas, county party meetings, state conventions, even through, online threats and personal confrontations within communities.
It starkly shows that winning general elections and controlling the party infrastructure are not always aligned goals. In fact, the incentives for each can be diametrically opposed sometimes.
That's a crucial point. There's this tension between appealing to the base to gain internal power versus appealing to the broader electorate to win general elections.
And the sources really highlight that often the very things that help you win control within the party structure, like ideological purity, loyalty tests, sticking to certain narratives, can actively harm your ability to win over moderates and independents come election day.
So here's something to consider as you think about all this. If, as these sources strongly suggest, this internal struggle reflects two fundamentally incompatible visions for the Republican Party, one aiming for broader electoral success, the other for ideological transformation and control of the base, can it ultimately find a way to hold together? Or is further fragmentation, maybe in structure, maybe